A question about kindness cut through the charged political air of the town hall, catching Donald Trump completely off guard. The room, packed with reporters clutching notepads and voters armed with pointed questions about policy, fell into an unexpected hush. No one had anticipated this moment, least of all the man standing behind the podium. The evening had started like any other campaign stop. The community center in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, hummed with the familiar energy of a political gathering. Local officials sat in their pressed suits, reporters positioned their cameras for the best angles, and carefully selected audience members reviewed their pre-approved questions about immigration reform, economic policies, and international relations. But among them sat 8-year-old Emily Matthews, her small hands fidgeting with the carefully folded piece of paper in her lap. She hadn't told anyone what she planned to ask, not even her mother, who sat beside her, scrolling through emails on her phone. Emily's world had been full of questions lately, ever since her father's military unit was deployed overseas 3 months ago. Questions about war, about peace, about why grown-ups couldn't just be nice to each other. The moderator worked through the audience methodically, each question following the expected script. Trump responded with his characteristic confidence, his answers hitting familiar talking points about making America great, building walls, and strengthening borders. The crowd responded with predictable waves of applause and murmured disagreement. Emily watched it all, her heart pounding harder with each person who stood up to speak. The question in her heart felt different from all these adult concerns about taxes and treaties. She wondered if she should just stay quiet, keep her hand down like her teacher always suggested when she asked questions that made people uncomfortable. But then she remembered her father's last words before he left. Sometimes the most important questions are the hardest ones to ask. When the moderator announced final questions, Emily's hand shot up before she could change her mind. Maybe it was the unexpectedness of seeing a child's raised hand in a sea of adults, or perhaps it was just coincidence, but the moderator pointed to her. The room shifted its attention, cameras swiveling, faces softening at the sight of the small girl in a yellow sundress standing up. Her mother finally looked up from her phone, surprise registering on her face. Emily took a deep breath, her voice smaller than she wanted but clear enough to carry through the sudden quiet. "Mr. Trump, with everything that's happening in the world, what does kindness mean to you?" The practiced expression on Trump's face froze. The teleprompters continued scrolling with prepared responses to expected questions, but his eyes fixed on the small girl waiting earnestly for an answer. The silence stretched, heavy with anticipation. But no one could have predicted what would happen next. For several long seconds, Trump stood motionless behind the podium. The familiar swagger, the confident gestures, the ready responses, all vanished in the face of this child's simple question. His eyes, usually sharp with political calculation, softened as they studied Emily's face. The audience stirred uncomfortably in their seats. Some exchanged confused glances, others leaned forward in anticipation. A reporter's coffee cup clattered against its saucer, the sound sharp in the unusual silence. Emily's mother reached for her daughter's hand, unsure whether to pull her back down to her seat. But Emily remained standing, her small shoulders squared despite her trembling hands. In that moment she looked so much like her father, the same determined set of her jaw, the same unwavering gaze. She had inherited more than just his deep brown eyes. She had his courage, too. Trump cleared his throat, an unexpectedly human sound in the politically charged atmosphere. He glanced at the teleprompter, then back at Emily. The prepared speeches scrolling past offered no guidance for this moment. "You know," he began, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it. "That's quite a question, young lady." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something internal. "Would you mind coming a little closer?" A Secret Service agent stepped forward, but Trump waved him back. Emily looked up at her mother, who nodded slowly, her face a mix of concern and curiosity. As Emily made her way down the aisle, her yellow sundress bright against the muted colors of the crowd, the cameras followed her movement. But for once, Trump seemed unaware of the media presence. He did something then that made the entire room catch its breath. Removing his microphone, he stepped away from the podium and sat down on the edge of the stage. The move brought him closer to Emily's eye level, though it broke every rule of political stagecraft. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone gentler than anyone had heard before. "Emily Matthews, sir." Her voice was steadier now, carried by the same courage that had prompted her question. "Emily," he repeated, as if testing the weight of her name. "Can I ask you something? What made you think about kindness today?" She glanced back at her mother, who had tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. The whole room seemed to lean in, wanting to hear her answer. Emily's fingers twisted the hem of her dress as she spoke. "My dad always says kindness is what we need most when the world feels scary," she said. "He's in Afghanistan now, and sometimes when I watch the news, everything looks so mean and angry. I just wondered, maybe if important people understood kindness better." Her voice trailed off, but the impact of her words resonated through the hall. Trump's expression shifted, something raw and genuine breaking through his political mask. Those closest to the stage saw his hands tighten on his knees, noticed the slight tremor in his shoulders. He looked out at the crowd for a moment, taking in the reporters poised to critique his every word, the voters ready to analyze his response, the cameras capturing every nuance. Then he looked back at Emily, and it was as if everyone else disappeared. "Your father," he said, his voice carrying a weight few had heard before, "he's taught you something very important, and maybe—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe it's time someone like me really listened." The atmosphere in the room shifted, charged with something more powerful than political energy. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. They all sensed that what would happen next would transcend ordinary campaign moments. And they were right. What happened next would change everyone in that room. Trump leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a tone that few had ever heard. Honest, unguarded, almost vulnerable. "You know, Emily, I don't often talk about this, but your question, it reminds me of something my mother used to say." The room held its breath. Trump rarely spoke about his mother, Mary, in public settings. Personal stories weren't part of his usual political repertoire, but there was nothing usual about this moment. "My mother believed that kindness was strength," he continued, his New York accent softening with memory. "Not weakness, like some people think. She used to tell me that any fool can be cruel, but it takes real courage to be kind." Emily nodded, understanding flowing between them. Trump's eyes grew distant, as if seeing something far beyond the community center's walls. "I remember once when I was maybe a little older than you, I came home angry. Some kids at school had been cruel. You know how children can be sometimes." He paused, his usual bravado completely gone. "I told my mother I wanted to get even, to show them I was stronger. You know what she did?" Emily shook her head, completely absorbed in the story. The entire room seemed to lean forward, reporters' fingers frozen above their keyboards. "She sat me down and made me cookies." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "But here's the real lesson. She made me make extra cookies to take to school the next day, for those same kids who had been mean to me." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the Trump they knew from television or Twitter. This was someone else entirely. "I didn't want to do it, of course. Thought it would make me look weak." He shook his head slowly. "But my mother insisted." "Donald," she said, "sometimes the bravest thing you can do is be kind when everything in you wants to be angry." Emily's eyes widened. "Did you give them the cookies?" "I did." Trump's voice carried a note of wonder, as if he was just now realizing the full impact of that childhood moment. "And you know what happened? Those kids became my friends. Not because they were afraid of me, but because kindness, real kindness, it has a power all its own." He looked directly at Emily then, his expression serious. "But that's not really what you're asking about, is it? There's something more." Emily's lower lip trembled slightly. "I miss my dad," she whispered, though the microphone caught her words, carrying them through the silent hall. "And sometimes when I watch you on TV, when I see all the fighting and angry words, I worry that kindness doesn't matter anymore, that it's not important to important people." The words hit Trump like a physical force. Several people in the audience wiped tears from their eyes. A veteran in the third row stood up straighter, his hand unconsciously touching the service pin on his lapel. "Emily," Trump began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. He looked out at the crowd, at the cameras, at the political machine he himself had helped create. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight. "You know, we talk a lot about making America great, about being strong, about winning." He paused, his next words careful and measured. "But maybe we've forgotten something important along the way, something your father understands better than most of us." The silence in the room deepened. Even the most hardened political reporters found themselves holding their breath. "Your father serves our country not just with weapons or strategies, but with something far more powerful. He serves with the belief that protecting others, caring about people he's never met, that's the highest form of kindness. And that kind of kindness, that's what truly makes America great." Tears were flowing freely now, not just from Emily and her mother, but from throughout the audience. A cameraman wiped his eyes with his sleeve, not caring that his shot was wobbling. Trump stood slowly, but he didn't return to the podium. Instead, he did something that made his security detail visibly nervous. He stepped completely off the stage. "Emily," he said, kneeling down to her level, "I want to thank you. Sometimes we all need a reminder of what really matters. Your father, he's fighting for more than just our country. He's fighting for a world where kindness still matters, where it matters most." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made everyone crane their necks to see, a small, worn photograph. "This is my mother," he said, showing it to Emily. "I carry it to remind me of her lessons. Would you like to know the last thing she ever said to me?" Emily nodded, entranced. She said, "Donald, you can build tall buildings, make lots of money, even become president someday. But at the end of your life, the only thing that will really matter is how many people's lives you touched with kindness." His voice caught slightly on the last word. For a moment, the mighty political figure was simply a son remembering his mother's wisdom, sharing it with a child who reminded him of what he once knew. Then, Trump did something unprecedented. He took the photo and pressed it into Emily's small hands. "I want you to have this," he said softly, "to remind you that no matter what you see on TV, no matter how angry the world seems, kindness will always matter. And people like your father, they're the ones showing us how to live it every day." The gesture sent a ripple of gasps through the crowd. Hardened political journalists found themselves swallowing hard. Campaign staffers exchanged stunned looks. This wasn't just off-script, it was something none of them had ever seen before. But what happened next would shake them even more. If you're enjoying this story of kindness so far, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It costs you nothing, but for us, especially in these early days, it means the world. Let's continue with what happens next. Emily looked down at the photograph in her hands, her fingers tracing the edges of the image showing a younger Trump with his mother. Her eyes welled with fresh tears, but these were different from before. Tears of understanding, of connection, of hope. Suddenly, a voice called out from the back of the room. "Sir?" The crowd turned to see an elderly man in a Vietnam veteran's cap struggling to his feet. His voice trembled with emotion. "I served with men who didn't come home, men who gave everything for others. That's the highest form of kindness, isn't it? Giving everything for people you'll never meet." Trump straightened, turning to face the veteran. "Yes, sir, it is," he replied, his voice carrying a new depth of understanding. "And maybe that's something we've lost sight of in all our political battles." The veteran nodded, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "My grandson's serving now, just like Emily's father." Sometimes I worry. I worry we're teaching the next generation that strength only comes from anger, from fighting. But real strength comes from kindness, Emily finished softly, still holding the photograph. The room collectively caught its breath. From the mouth of a child came the wisdom they all needed to hear. Trump looked at Emily, then at the veteran, then swept his gaze across the entire room. Something had shifted fundamentally in the atmosphere. The political barriers that usually divided such gatherings had melted away, replaced by something more powerful, a shared recognition of a forgotten truth. "You know," Trump said, his voice carrying easily through the silence, "we spend so much time in politics talking about power, about winning, about being tough." He paused, looking again at the photograph in Emily's hands. "But maybe the toughest thing of all is to stay kind in a world that often isn't." A woman in the front row stood up, tears streaming down her face. "My mother used to say that kindness is like a light," she offered. "The darker the world gets, the more important it is to keep it burning." More people began to stand, not to argue or debate, but to share. Stories of kindness received and given flowed through the room. A teacher spoke about a student who shared lunch with a lonely classmate. A businessman described how a stranger's kindness during his darkest hour had saved his life. A nurse shared how small acts of kindness gave her patients the strength to keep fighting. Each story built upon the last, creating a tapestry of human connection that transcended political affiliations. Emily listened to them all, still clutching the photograph, her face glowing with the realization that her simple question had unleashed something extraordinary. Trump remained off the stage, standing beside Emily, listening with an intensity few had ever seen in him. His usual defensive posture had disappeared, replaced by something more genuine, more human. Then he did something that would be talked about for years to come. Reaching for the microphone, he gestured for Emily to join him in the center of the room. "Emily," he said, his voice carrying a weight of decision, "I want to make you a promise. Not as a politician, but as someone who needed to be reminded of what really matters." The room hushed again, camera lights catching the tears still glistening on faces throughout the audience. "From this day forward, before every speech I give, every decision I make, I'm going to look at your father's empty chair at your dinner table. I'm going to remember that true leadership isn't about being the toughest or the loudest. It's about remembering the Emily Matthewses of this world, waiting for their fathers to come home." Emily's mother covered her mouth, tears flowing freely. The veteran in the back stood at attention, offering a silent salute. "And this photograph," Trump continued, gently touching the picture Emily still held, "it's not just my mother anymore. It's a reminder that every person in this room, every American watching at home, every soldier serving overseas, they all have someone who taught them about kindness. Someone who believes in their ability to make the world a little better, a little kinder." A campaign aide approached with a notepad, presumably to steer things back to schedule, but Trump waved him off. This moment wasn't about politics anymore. "But I need your help, Emily," he said, kneeling once more to meet her eyes. "Will you promise me something too?" She nodded, her small face serious with the weight of the moment. "Promise me you'll never stop asking the hard questions. Promise me you'll keep reminding the grown-ups what really matters. Because sometimes," his voice caught slightly, "sometimes we forget. We get caught up in winning, in being right, in being strong. We forget that the strongest thing we can do is stay kind." Emily straightened her shoulders, looking remarkably like her father in that moment. "I promise," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the silent room. The impact of those two simple words seemed to touch everyone present. Reporters lowered their cameras, feeling the inadequacy of trying to capture this moment in mere images or words. Political staffers wiped tears from their eyes, their carefully planned schedules and talking points forgotten. A soft sound began to fill the room. At first, just a few people, then more joining in. Applause, but not the usual political kind. This was something different, something real. It was the sound of hearts being touched, of perspective shifting, of priorities being quietly but fundamentally reordered. Trump stood, placing a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. He looked out at the crowd, but his expression wasn't that of a politician surveying potential voters. It was the look of someone seeing fellow human beings, each with their own stories of kindness given and received, each carrying their own versions of his mother's photograph. The veteran who had spoken earlier made his way forward, moving slowly but purposefully through the crowd. When he reached Emily, he unpinned something from his jacket, a small gold star that glinted under the lights. "Young lady," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "this was given to me for courage in battle, but today you've shown us an even greater kind of courage, the courage to remind us of who we really are." As the star changed hands, something profound settled over the gathering. This wasn't just about a child's question anymore. It wasn't even about Trump's unexpected response. This was about something far more fundamental. A recognition that in a world of political divisions and carefully crafted images, authentic kindness still held the power to break down walls and touch hearts. But what came next would transform this powerful moment into something even more extraordinary. The doors at the back of the community center suddenly opened. A shaft of late-afternoon sunlight cut through the room, and a figure appeared in uniform. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Daddy!" Captain James Matthews stood in the doorway, still in his combat fatigues, having just returned from Afghanistan. He hadn't planned to surprise his daughter here. It was pure coincidence, a miracle of timing that brought him to this exact moment. Emily ran through the crowd, which parted like water, still clutching Trump's mother's photograph and the veteran's gold star. Her father dropped his duffel bag just in time to catch her as she launched herself into his arms. Trump watched the reunion, emotion plain on his face. This wasn't about politics or photo ops. This was about everything Emily had asked, about kindness, about what really matters, about the connections that give life its deepest meaning. The veteran who had given his medal made his way over to Captain Matthews, offering a crisp salute that was immediately returned. No words were needed. Their eyes said everything about service, sacrifice, and the kind of kindness that puts others first. Emily's father carried her back to where Trump stood. "Sir," he said, shifting Emily to one arm so he could shake Trump's hand, "I heard everything from the back. Thank you for showing my daughter that kindness still has a place in this world." Trump gripped his hand firmly. "No, Captain Matthews. Thank your daughter for reminding all of us what we should never have forgotten." The room was so quiet you could hear the afternoon sunlight shifting through the dust motes. Political divisions, ideological differences, campaign strategies, all seemed to fade in the face of this moment's simple truth. Emily, still in her father's arms, looked at the photograph in her hands, then at Trump. "Your mom would be proud of you today," she said softly. Those simple words, spoken with a child's direct wisdom, seemed to touch something deep in Trump's soul. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. As the sun set outside the community center windows, casting long shadows across the gathered crowd, something had fundamentally changed. A child's question about kindness had transformed not just a political event, but everyone who witnessed it. The next day, headlines would try to capture what happened. Videos would go viral. Pundits would debate the political implications. But for those who were there, the real story wasn't in the media coverage or social media buzz. It was in the reminder that kindness, real, genuine, courageous kindness, still holds the power to bridge our deepest divides and touch our hearts in ways that nothing else can. And it often comes from the most unexpected sources, like an 8-year-old girl brave enough to ask the question that really matters. If this story touched your heart, remember that kindness is something we can all choose every day. Share this message with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to join our community of storytellers and believers in the power of human connection. Because in the end, Emily was right. Kindness will always matter as long as there are people brave enough to choose it. The world needs your kindness today. How will you answer that call?